My name is Steph Burlton. I use she, her pronouns. I'm an athlete, a queer filmmaker, and proud lesbian.
I'm Katie Burlton. My pronouns are she and her. I identify as a femme lesbian, and I'm a model, performer, and writer.
We're a married couple living on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, on the land also known as Vancouver. This city that we call home is beautiful, vibrant, and an amazing place to be queer. But there's still so much that we don't know about our own community. Even though we've been together as an out lesbian couple for more than a decade, we still have a lot to learn.
So we're on a mission to discover as much as we can about queer Vancouver, and specifically the lives of queer women and other marginalized folks in the community. We want to know our queer history, how things have changed over the years, what the community looks like today, and where things are headed for future generations. We're going to start by looking into Vancouver's queer past. So much of what we already know is about the gay liberation movement and the history of gay men. But what about our history? What about lesbian history? We want to learn about the queer women who paved the way for us and so many others in the community.
So we're diving into the past about 50 years, looking at the 1970s and the 1980s in queer Vancouver. The first thing we need to do is find some older, wiser lesbians, or as we like to call them, OWLS.
My name is Ellen Woodsworth, she, her, we. Identify as a lesbian member of the queer community.
My name is Marcia Abelowitz. My pronouns are she and her. I retired a long time ago as a mental health social worker.
My name is Jan Radford. My pronouns are she and her. I'm a 69-year-old chapstick lesbian.
My name is Nora D. Randall. My pronouns are she and her. I'm most comfortable saying I'm a lesbian feminist.
You have to remember, homosexuality was illegal in Canada. My family was very progressive and open, but they didn't talk about homosexuality. I don't know where that fear came from, except that, of course, I would know it was illegal. But there was no social context for it.
In the early 70s, we would assume it was becoming safer for people to come out of the closet because of the decriminalization of homosexuality in Canada in 1969. So we want to talk to a queer historian about that time and what effect the change in the laws really had.
My name is Elle Chenier. I use they, them pronouns, and I am a professor of history at Simon Fraser University. Pierre Elliott Trudeau, the prime minister at the time, took a very, I think, clear sort of moral political stance that homosexuality really wasn't a concern of criminal law. The partial decriminalization of same-sex sex mattered. But I think it maybe matters in ways that are a little bit different than a lot of people think. So in fact, most people who were criminally charged, weren't charged under sodomy laws. They were charged under gross indecency and other laws. And those laws continued to be used. And in fact, we now know that policing actually became more aggressive and ramped up afterwards. So you could say it was a kind of homophobic reaction to the liberalization of our laws.
The whole society was homophobic. The police were very homophobic. You couldn't get help from the police.
There was so much social pressure and stigma about being homosexual or lesbian that women couldn't afford to come out publicly. They had to have clandestine relationships with other women.
It was still considered a disease, a mental health disease.
There was a lot of abuse of women by the psychiatric profession. Women were being put into mental hospitals, given shock treatment for being lesbians.
To put it in context, too, that, all of the 70s and 80s, women that were coming out as lesbians, their husbands, if they had been previously married, were taking them to court and getting full custody of the children. So it was a really scary time.
Like when I first realized I was a lesbian, I was afraid that I would be disowned because I came from a very religious Catholic family.
Many, many, many women were being penalized, criminalized, and institutionalized.
Back then, it was obviously still a pretty dangerous time to be queer, and women definitely faced far more barriers than gay men.
We had the oppression of being women, and then we had the problem with really low paid jobs, the work of unpaid work in the home. And if you were Indigenous or if you were Black or Asian, it was really, really, really much, much harder.
So interestingly, here, like elsewhere, most lesbians ended up joining the women's movement.
There was a group at Simon Fraser called the Women's Caucus. And I heard about that from my husband because he was out at SFU. He said, it's pretty interesting what's going on, you should go. So I went, and it was very exciting because they were the first women in Vancouver who were starting to write articles and give talks about women's liberation, about the oppression of women, that women should be standing up for themselves. And it was like new information for me.
Women needed women's space, right? And we didn't have any, and then we started creating women's space.
So I saw that we needed to be situated within the women's movement, but I saw how the potential of the women's movement also as a progressive revolutionary movement.
To me, at least in the circle I traveled, it was a very political time. There was marches and, claiming women's space, and, we tried to get money to build a women's center and, things like that.
We went down to the Women's Center on Carroll Street, and there was all kinds of things going on, and there was movie nights, and the Pedestal organized out of there, which was a feminist newspaper. So we both started working on the Pedestal. So we were reading The Second Sex and The Female Eunuch, and then we found out about Jane Rule, and we were reading Jane Rule. It was very funny because, we were reading all these books, and I can remember at one point I said, "Do you think that Jane Rule's a lesbian?" "Yes, probably."
And I thought, I have to come out. I have to come out. And I felt the power of the women's movement. It was tangible. And I had tons of women around me. And I came out as a lesbian feminist.
I decided to get some women's groups going. And mainly it was younger women who were kind of trying to find themselves. So we had 2 or 3 or 4 of those groups. And then in the groups, the women started saying that they were lesbians, or they were attracted to women, or they were having an affair with a woman, but they were married. What were they going to do? And it was good for them, and it was good for me. Because at the start of it, I was still married. And by the end of it, I wasn't.
The predominant issues in the feminist movement were around access to abortion and not lesbianism. But the connection that I've always seen to the two issues is that the pro-choice movement was never just about access to abortion. It was about bodily autonomy.
I was very involved with the student movement and the women's movement, and then got involved with Vancouver Women's Caucus and was part of the On to Ottawa abortion caravan, where women from coast to coast to coast came together to demand women's right to choose. And when the Prime Minister wouldn't meet with us and only 2 MPs met with us, we decided we had to get the message across in person. So we went and chained ourselves in the House of Commons all around the upper gallery of the House of Commons and shouted out women's right to choose. Women are dying because they're not able to get abortion, and Indigenous women are being sterilized, and we were raising the issues and what a crisis it was.
In the 1970s, and I think even still for many of us today, you grew up knowing you don't own your own body. Other people have a right to pass judgment on it, to make comments on it. You're not safe at night. That's not owning your body. You can't go wherever you want. So all of those issues, there's no difference between being a queer woman and being a straight woman. You're not safe at night when you walk the streets.
Some people asked me to start a self-defense group for women. I recruited a group of women, and we all taught self-defense, and I worked for the mental health service, so I put down that I would teach self-defense and women's issues, and so they started sending me all around running the self-defense groups. Of course, a lot of the women in those groups were lesbians, and a lot of women in those groups had been sexually abused, so it was a real eye-opener for me.
When gay liberation takes off and activism in general, so those 2 political movements are sort of playing out in the 1970s. And what women found everywhere, including in Vancouver, is that gay men were just as sexist as straight men. And it was intolerable.
GATE was organizing things in Vancouver, so we certainly joined the demonstrations and supported GATE.
The guys from the Gay Alliance Toward Equality, GATE, they would call up and try to convince us to join GATE.
It was very much a white gay movement, and the issues were defined by those men who had that power.
It seemed like the gay men had a lot more money and they were going to Palm Springs and, all the rest of it. And the lesbians were working at the East End Food Co-op in their flannel shirts, not going anywhere,
They had the bars, they owned the bars, they owned the bookstores, they had small businesses. So their lives were so different than women's lives.
There was quite a division, I think, between, at least in my world, between the dykes and the, East Side and gay men.
So if you're looking for lesbians, you find them feminist bookstores, feminist presses, feminist publications, and feminist organizations. That's where they were. That's where they were working. But it must be said, there they had to deal with homophobia.
We were always organizing around issues, and then we began to bring up being lesbians, and there was some blowback from that.
I said to Pedestal, the newspaper of the Vancouver Women's Caucus, I wanted to do some writing about lesbian feminism. And they said, no way. That's an American cultural import. It's got nothing to do with the women's movement or politics. And I felt so deeply betrayed by these women that I'd worked with.
One of the women in the collective, she wrote an article called Differences in the Pedestal, and explaining that when the Pedestal had started out in 1969, it was mostly socialist women who were really committed to anti-capitalism, and that there had been an influx of, she called us lesbian lifestylists from the States. And that was me and Josie. I mean, we didn't mean to be.
Yeah, there became a bit of a rift in whether, the lesbians were taking over women's spaces, and we were struggling because we were trying to find out who we were, our identity and stuff. And so it was really important to have women-only spaces, but also lesbian-only spaces.
This seemed like a pivotal time when queer women started creating their own spaces, but also standing their ground in feminist spaces. The Pedestal, for instance. After disagreements among the collective about whether or not lesbianism belonged in the publication, it actually became a lesbian feminist newspaper just a few years later.
So where were lesbians carving out space for themselves? Today, Commercial Drive is known as the main neighborhood for queer women. But was it always this way? What about the Drive first attracted lesbians?
I lived right off the Drive for 34 years.
I think there were a bunch of lesbians living there. There was a building at 4th and Commercial, which I think had a whole bunch of lesbians in it. And then there was another one at 8th and Commercial that had lesbian.
Lesbians live in the east side of town, and gay men live in the West End. And it's pure economics. Women don't have the money to live in the West End. Who wouldn't want to live by the ocean?
The Drive in the, 80s and the late 70s and the 80s, was the lesbian area, like the West End was for the men. But I don't know that lots of the community knew that, like the broader Vancouver neighborhood, I mean, I think it was, as we know, a really strong Italian community.
And at that time, there were coffee bars on Commercial Drive, but they were mostly Italian men. The Polfi bar was right across the street, and the Polfi bar was an Italian men's coffee bar. So we went in and we stood at the bar. We might have been the first women who had ever gone into the coffee bar. And of course, we're there in our jeans and our boots and our t-shirts. Nobody refused us service, but the welcome mat was not out.
Through the 70s, it sounds like a lot of lesbians in Vancouver were living on Commercial Drive and active in the feminist movement. But we also know that there must have been plenty of other queer women back then who didn't share those same experiences.
There was quite a division between the working class people on the east side and the people on the west side who had more money. And it was also really racially divided. In all the lesbian groups, there'd be maybe one Chinese person, one or two First Nations women. Most of the First Nations people I knew weren't at university. And the ones that were at university, as far as I know, they were straight, but they maybe weren't. And most of the Asian women that I knew, even the ones that were lesbian, were really closeted at that time.
I'm Joy Masahara. I'm a third-generation Japanese Canadian. I'm a lesbian. I am a family physician. I grew up in very white Vancouver. I was just used to not having very many people of color around me or as my friends or in my circles because there just weren't. From a Asian background family, these are things you don't really talk about and not really something that's, there's still a lot of stigma around being queer in the Asian community. I had just tons of internalized homophobia. And so it was challenging to be out. Later on, there was probably a bit more interaction with racialized queer people.
And it was not too much later that we started to put an intersectional lens on the queer movement and started to talk about race, started to talk about gender, started to talk about trans issues. It was much later.
Moving into the 80s, it sounds like it was still a pretty difficult time to be queer, and it was predominantly white, privileged women who were able to come out. But lesbians really were starting to take up space, and the community in Vancouver was growing. There were more groups for queer women, more places to socialize, and there was even a lesbian conference in 1981.
We decided we would organize a women's conference, which we held at Langara. It was still pretty hard in the 80s. I'd say that conference was overwhelmingly younger white women.
And I remember going with some trepidation, and making sure that there would be other people there that I knew and stuff like that. And here we had, all kinds of, interesting speakers coming to talk about, feminism, but, lesbian feminism and stuff like that. There were older lesbians who had a very different experience, of course. And so listening to them talk about what it was like for them and how, so it was a learning time, and it was like, wow.
We wove in and out of what existed and what we had to create.
As the community grew and expands, then they created the Lesbian Community Center. What that represents is a moment in time where there's a critical mass where they say, okay, we need a space where we can just talk about our issues separately. And these spaces were always not just political, they were also social. Hangouts, you would have art, maybe you might have theater. There's lots of different things you can do. When you own your own space, you can do all kinds of things.
Yeah, we wanted to have a space where lesbians could be themselves.
Well, the Lesbian Center was at the corner of Venables and Commercial, and it was upstairs over where Women's Wear is now. And it was kept open by volunteers, and there were, they had meetings there, and they had coffee houses, and people would sing and stuff, and I performed there. I was the co-founder with Jackie Crosland of Random Acts, which was a storytelling and theater company telling the stories of working women and lesbians. So after I did the story of Marlene and the chicken yard at the Lesbian Center, Jackie and I started working together. We got together as partners at that time too.
Places like the Lesbian Center were obviously so important to the community at the time. Designated spaces where lesbians could gather and socialize led to all kinds of great things, like the creation of Nora and Jackie's theater company.
Having a place to hang out with just exclusively with lesbians, was really an important evolution in the growth of the lesbian community here in Vancouver.
And so, the community, it grew over time. And as more women would leave marriages or identify as lesbian.
As lesbians, we didn't seem to be able to maintain a space of our own for any length of time. Because, first of all, we didn't make as much money as men, and secondly, a lot of women had kids.
Maintaining queer spaces has always been difficult and still is, even today, especially when those spaces are specifically for lesbians, queer women, and other marginalized folks in the community.
It sounds like back then there were some permanent queer spaces in the city, but they never lasted too long. So we're wondering, where else did queer women connect with each other, and how did they create community?
Some of my fondest memories would be women's coffee houses. So on Friday nights, we would get together in these dark places with candles, and you knew that it would be other lesbians who'd be coming to these events. So it became, well, it was a really nice way to meet other lesbians.
There were two women named Dorothy and Jackie, and they opened the Ms. Club. So, and it was on 4th Avenue, kind of between Burrard and Vine. And it didn't last very long, but it was a club for kind of lesbian feminists. There was also a bar at the corner of Davie and Seymour in the basement called Champagne Charlie's. And that was a lesbian hangout.
And then there was a Vanport pub down on Main and by the train station. I didn't like going out so late at night, so I went sort of in the late afternoon. There was very few people, and I came back and I said, I went down to the Vanport. I didn't see any lesbians. And they said, what did you see? And I just said, I saw these big guys playing pool. She said, those were the lesbians.
It was a group, now that I think about it too, it was called the Gazebo Connection.
I think that the Gazebo Connection was going at that time, which was more for closeted professional women.
So they would put on events, and you'd kind of have to know someone either in the know to find out when the events were and where they were. And I think it was a lot of women who may have been professional women, so I suspect some of them were probably not super out.
I also got really involved in the outdoor club for women.
It was like a magnet. There maybe was one or two straight women that were in the group at the beginning, and we were very friendly. We were not discriminatory. And it was bold to be an outdoor club for women.
So while queer visibility really increased through the 80s, the community was also grappling with terrible loss. The AIDS crisis hit Vancouver along with many other cities, and particularly affected gay men and trans women.
It must have been such a truly devastating period, but it was also an opportunity for the entire queer community to really come together, maybe for the first time.
My name is Jaylene Time. What's interesting to know about myself as an Indigenous two-spirit trans human being is my life experience is really layered, and when it comes to being part of community, it's very rich as well. And that's a time with the HIV/AIDS epidemic was really it was bringing a lot of confusion and devastation to our community.
Yeah, so I remember the start of the AIDS epidemic, and I was a nurse, and so I was working in healthcare. So we were hearing about all of this, illness that was hitting gay men. It was a horrible, horrible time, and watching friends being diagnosed with HIV, as they later came up to call it. People were so sick and dying, and
so people didn't know really what was going on, but what they did know is that their friends needed support.
It started to hit really close to home. And and lesbians were out in full force for the AIDS walk and fundraising, and and then the Dr. Peter Center. And my sense is that the lesbian community really rallied around that.
It's an important part of queer history that often goes unacknowledged, the way that lesbian communities everywhere really rallied during the AIDS epidemic.
That act of solidarity is actually the reason why the L was moved to come first in the GLBT acronym at the time, as a nod to the huge impact that it had when lesbians came together to support the people who were suffering. So what's most interesting about learning more of Vancouver's queer history is that so many things have really changed and some haven't changed at all. While it's definitely much safer to be a queer woman in Vancouver today, we still struggle to maintain our own spaces, and there is more work to do when it comes to intersectionality and uplifting the most marginalized members of our community.
But we've learned so much about this city's past, and we're ready to keep going into the 1990s and 2000s to see what more there is to discover.